Do you think UFOs, the paranormal, weird history, cryptozoology, and outsider art are pretty darn cool? Then you're in the right place. Welcome to High Strangeness with your host, Steve Berg.
The video version. Welcome, friends, to another episode of High Strangeness. Tonight, my guest is Joshua Dairen, and I'm going to read you a little bit of bio of Joshua. So here we go, folks. Joshua Dairen is a verified content creator and researcher from Auburn, Alabama, whose deep dive into history and the paranormal has led him to become a rising star in both genres. He has been featured in documentaries, podcasts, and other mediums all about the paranormal and history across the country. He has become a TikTok sensation for the state of Alabama and the South, and his research is expanding rapidly across the country. Joshua, thank you so much for being here, man.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm always glad to be here.
Yeah. I recently have kind of come across Joshua's work. He does, we'll get into it. I'll let him explain more. But he does these amazing videos where and you put them out on multiple platforms, right? TikTok, Instagram.
Yeah, pretty much anywhere. I kind of sort of put them on Threads a little bit, but once I get to posting like on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, I usually don't go any further than that.
Right. Three is that's good. That's good. But I mean, these videos, I have to tell you, folks, like they are so damn incredible. You can just go, you can spend an afternoon, go on his site and just go through his videos and you will learn, like, sure, some of the things I had kind of heard about first off, but he gave me so many more details about these cases or these events. And it just like the way you kind of vacillate between historical events, paranormal, urban legends, or like what fast food restaurants are from Alabama and the South. I mean, like it to me, it's just I love it, man. So first off, I want to congratulate you on preserving the history of these kind of this folklore and these tales because I think that's very important. If someone's not doing it, they're all going to go away.
Yeah, and I definitely agree, and that's been a big part of it too, because I do believe that if we don't continue to tell stories, then these stories get lost. And if you just look through history, storytelling has played a big part in culture,
Right.
and so there's always a storyteller of some sort. I mean, you have Aesop's fables. Those stories are told and passed down even to now into our childhood, so we can learn good lessons. And I think that we could still take those same principles from these urban legends that we kind of, sometimes poke fun at or don't believe, or just just to have a thrill on a Halloween night. We can take those same lessons from that and dig a little deeper. So I really just love doing that. I'm curious by nature. I'm not really a history buff per se, but I do love the history of a lot of these places and haunts and things of that nature. So yeah, I'm just glad to have a space for me where I can just be me and talk.
Yeah, well, I think we're all grateful too because once you if you have not seen these videos, you will definitely, absolutely, 100% be enlightened because you're digging deep. In fact, like one thing I just kind of wanted to ask you off the start, what is your process for finding your new story to tell? Like, I mean, like obviously the internet is a wonderful resource of like a lot of this stuff, but like, what is your process? How do you find the story? Do you go in kind of looking for a specific type of subject, or
I really don't go in looking for a specific type of subject. Usually I just kind of tell what I find interesting. And sometimes when I'm looking for something else will pop up. So then I'll take a note of that. I'll keep a tab open and say, hey, okay, I'm going to come back to this, but this isn't what I'm researching right now. So um, usually it happens pretty organically unless people just straight up tell me stories to cover.
Right.
A great example of this is Corpsewood Manor. I would have never come across this story unless somebody had told me. And then once I came across it, it took me about 3 to 4 months to actually do the full research that I wanted to do. So it just sat as a tab. But in the process of looking up Corpsewood Manor, I came across other true crime stories. So I still have some of those on tap that I want to tell. And usually it just happens organically like that. So I never really go in, searching like witch, Georgia, haunted. Usually it comes across in some other list or a comment or a message or, hey, like I grew up here, like, can you tell this story? And then I'll say, yeah, I'll look into it. And if I could find enough meat to the story, 9 times out of 10, I'll tell it.
Wow, that's so great. So I didn't know you sometimes take requests. Like if someone has something that interests you, that you'll go into it. That's wonderful.
Yeah, I love requests. Honestly, if I could get just a bank of just requests, it would make my life a little bit easier sometimes. Because sometimes the well gets really dry, or I get burned out, or I have other responsibilities and priorities I
Right.
have to take care of. And having kind of a bank of um, requests is probably going to be easier. So honestly, I'm probably going to put a Google sheet out and just say, hey, like, just drop me some stories that you want me to cover in the South or wherever. It doesn't even really have to be in the South at this point, and I will look into it and I'll cover it.
Right, because it does seem like maybe even more so recently, you have kind of ventured out a little bit out of the South. I mean, it seems like a lot of it is Alabama and Georgia,
Yeah.
but I can tell that you are starting to flirt around with crossing some borders.
Yeah, I'm doing a little flirting, I would say.
Yeah.
I wanted so a couple of the recent stories is one out of Los Angeles. I was just curious to see like who would see it, if they would see it, how they would respond to it, in a way that might be a little different than those in the South. Another one I did was Colorado. It was another look and see like how do people in the Southwest respond to stories like these. I've done a few I've done a few in the North overall, but I really try to stay away from the North only because there are so many people telling stories there that I don't even feel like I'm necessary in that
Hmm.
space. Um, but I am trying to get a little bit deeper in the South. So
Right.
I have a story coming out in Texas, and I'm trying to get some unique places like North Carolina as well. So I have a story that's coming out in North Carolina as well, um, and I believe it's Charlotte, I believe, and the other one is Austin, Texas. So I like to kind of dabble, if you will, just to see if there might be another opportunity for me to tell some lesser known urban legends in some of these places.
Right, right, right. So, I mean, when did you actually start making these videos?
I started making these videos on June 1st.
This June?
No, 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 no. Last
Oh,
June.
okay. I was like,
Uh,
oh my God, you were been busy, dude.
yeah.
I was like,
I would be a robot or a clone or like a government plant if I did that that soon. But no, I started a little over a year ago, actually making the content around these stories. And if you were to go back a year ago to June 1st and look at my first story, my God, I have grown so much in my storytelling and fact checking and making ability and um, pronunciations and everything. So it's been a journey.
yeah. Well, I mean, you're on a great stride right now, man. Let me tell you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is there like I have like I've always been fascinated. I kind of I guess most of this show we kind of focus on like UFOs, the paranormal, and high strangeness, hence the show title. um, But I personally am like really fascinated by kind of, and I don't, I wish I had a better term for this, but I call it like the magic of place. Like I feel like there is a certain magic about, for instance, I recently, somewhat recently in the last like 2 years ago, moved back to Omaha, Nebraska, where I'm originally from. Having lived in LA for over 20 years. But when I came back here, I was looking at Nebraska in a new way, especially eastern Nebraska, where I'm from. And growing up, I always loved this stuff, but I was like, not much really happened in Nebraska. We had a couple of UFO things, a haunted building or two, maybe a Bigfoot sighting. But when I really focused and started really looking, I was like, oh my Lord, eastern Nebraska is as weird as anywhere,
Yeah, it is. I was gonna say that. I was like, wow, you had no idea what kind of treasure trove you were sitting on until you came back. Because
Yes.
it is that is that's a low key, very active place.
Yeah, it is. It really is, man. Like, and it's weird. But like, I have my own kind of ideas, maybe, of why I think Eastern Nebraska has, a lot of this weird stuff: UFOs, Bigfoot, cryptids, a lot of ghost activity, some weird cult stuff. But do you feel like there is certain places that are just more like rife for, weirdness and odd things?
Yeah, and I will start out by saying it's easy for people in the South to just instantly say, "Yeah, of course," because the Native Americans were here. but I'm going to go ahead and say that now it has nothing to do with the Native Americans. Um, it just has to do with, I think, like I I found that places that had a mark in socio-cultural like movements also tend to have high counts of urban legends surrounding them.
Mm,
So, you know, if you, I mean, you just look at Alabama, like you have a lot of different groups of people coming in and out. So you have a lot of storytelling that's being mixed in. So now you have storytelling plus different cultural groups, and you have different cultural movements happening, um, constantly flowing in and out. And so from there, urban legends that are unique in nature are built, certain beliefs are built. I think that sometimes places like Alabama kind of get overlooked with that. And that's what, but Alabama has, and Alabama, I've covered almost 250, I think, like just different Alabama urban legends. And there's still more that I haven't touched. And I
right.
think that you wouldn't know that on the surface, but if you like kind of dig deep, you say, wow, like I'm looking at Alabama in a different light, very similar to what I think your experience was for Omaha and Eastern Nebraska.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's easy to forget because of all the things that happen, how much has actually happened, and how many different types of people are coming in and out of places like these and leaving their stories with them. Because
Right.
all different cultural groups also have different types of storytellers. And those storytellers tell tales and spin tales. And now you have this cryptid popping up. You don't know where it came from, but you know, like the woods in this area have this, you know, have a dog man. Well, where did the dog man come from? Well, that actually originates from some group of people that moved in Alabama and moved out of Alabama due to cultural movements. Um, and not to be too long with it, but it makes me think of places like Louisiana. Louisiana has the Rougarou, which is a descendant of the Lougarou, which is not even like United States based at all. It was just carried over from a completely different group of like European people who brought the Dogman lore to Louisiana. But because those people were there and they filled um, the cultural spaces from there, well, now you have the Lougarou turning into the Rougarou, and now the Dogman tale is born. But with that comes an actual cryptid that people have claimed that they've seen that's transformed over time. And so as a demographic shift and the cultural things shift, you know, now you have stories built on the basis of Louisiana that come from different ethnic groups and different cultural movements that happen. So um, that's my long-winded way to say yes. I 100% think that uh, it comes from the different like, or it comes from different like cultural things.
I completely agree with you 100%. Like, you know, it's because I've experienced the same thing in Nebraska. You know, there was different, you know, like Nebraska is not an old state, you know, comparatively, even, you know, to a lot of the eastern states or the states down south, but like you can kind of trace the folklore of when different people started
Yeah.
homesteading here. And like I've been kind of following this like cult from Wales uh back in the 1800s who were like too extreme for Wales, and they were super misogynistic. They're kind of awful in my opinion. But they brought over a ton of really like hardcore folklore and kind of ghost stories. And now this small town Nebraska that was started by this cult group has some of, and it's a tiny town. I'm talking like 1,500 people. They have a kind of well-known ghost activity, poltergeist activity. Like 2 paranormal shows have been there. It's called
Wow.
Wymore, Nebraska, but it's this tiny little speck of a place. But if you trace the cultural history of it, you're like, oh, okay, I see where the folklore and you know mythology, or maybe it's real. You know, I have no idea. Came from though, and so
Yeah.
like you were saying, the cultural lens that you look at is so damn important to these stories.
Yeah. And that's why, and it kind of to kind of piggyback off that, um, you know, I am a believer of, you know, people being able to create thought forms and things. So you go to
Hmm.
this place and these stories are told that have a deep cultural impact over time. You keep leaving that energy, you keep leaving that energy, and you keep leaving that energy. Well, now those stories start to become alive. Whether that's whether that's actual paranormal activity that's organic or whether that's created paranormal activity. That's just my belief that that we can create that um that kind of activity. And it kind of goes into how I'm starting to see paranormal investigations. And uh, John Titty is a great person to talk to about the interception of energy, and how it can uh, just kind of be left somewhere. And so I had a conversation with him that made me think personally, my own personal beliefs on like why certain energies are felt in certain places. And I do think that how somebody investigates and the energy that they leave over affects the next person who comes to investigate. Because if they come in and they're antagonistic and they're provocative and they're trying to really stir something up and get the juices flowing, but in a negative way, well, now the next person who comes is going to feel that the same way that you can walk into a building and um, you could say, wow, like this Winn-Dixie, like it has good energy. The people here are great. Like I can feel this. I can literally feel the energy around me. Or you can go into a fast food restaurant and say, wow, like I do not want to be here. The
Yeah.
energy is thick. And so I, I, I feel that that same thing kind of occurs with storytelling and how deeply rooted certain cultures are in the places in the stories that we tell. So it's kind of cool that you say that about the cult, and then now like they have some real activity that nobody can really explain, but it's there, and
Yep.
the stories have come from somewhere.
Yep.
And you mentioned like the cult from Wales, but Wales is a really cool epicenter for a lot of paranormal activity.
Oh, it sure is. Yeah.
Like the Banshee, like that's an entity that in some places comes from like Welsh um, lore, but it finds its way in the United States because of the cultural movements. And so now people are like, I've seen this entity, or I've had an experience with this entity, but it's not a United States entity. It's something that comes from somewhere else.
Right. That see, okay, man, like we are on the same page, my man, because I for so long kind of thought that there were, like the John Keel type window areas, or there was certain places where reality is thin or whatever, and maybe that is true. There might still that still could be a possibility, but the kind of notion or idea that our stories and our narratives and our emotions imprint upon a place. It's like,
Yeah.
I think for a lot of people, they think, oh, I'm going to go to this place because it's enchanted and magical and wonderful and weird things happen there. But you might be able to imprint and enchant your own backyard. Like,
Yeah.
for instance, like Colin Andrews, who is a famous crop circle investigator in England. He was investigating all these crop circles back in the 80s and 90s, and some of them they turned out to be hoaxes that were made by crop circle makers. But they were having weird activity. Like people would be thrown around, orbs of light would be everywhere. It was kind of like poltergeist activity. So I feel like these groups of people going there and like emotionally investing can enchant a place. And I love what you said about Tenny's notion of when you go to a place, whatever if the last investigator was like kind of a bro dog, kind of like aggressive, like, hey, come out, ghost. Or like,
Yeah.
sometimes the Bigfoot investigators are banging on trees, they're like have 3 guns on them, dogs. I'm like, well, that's what you might get back then. Like
Yeah. Yeah. And also not to pitch myself as like some type of I know all in this space, but I've definitely done a lot of contemplating, and I and on that same notion, if we can set our intentions and manifest things, then who's to say we can't also do that for certain places as well?
Yep.
So if we are setting our intentions and manifesting some like malicious or negative energy, who's to say we are not putting out that malicious or negative energy into that space to be left for others to encounter, and now they're feeding into essentially a monster that we created because of the intentions that we came. And
Right.
I had a really great experience um, learning about how energy can create certain reactions at Belvoir Winery when we did our investigation. So I was investigating with Aaron, and that whole group is big on making sure to investigate with love and light, like coming with good
Yeah.
intentions. Treat your investigation as if you would treat like an encounter with a human being.
Right.
So be intentional, be positive, uh, and don't, everybody wants to go into an investigation to be like, demons, come out, demons, demon, you demon. And like, and I thought about that. And I was like, well, if this is a person on this other side, and I immediately walk in here, and because I have an experience, I'm just like, demon, you demon, like, how would that make that person feel? Well, they might not respond in the best way. Because I know if I was on the other side, I'd be like, I'll show you a demon. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not, but I'll show you one. Let me crawl on the roof or like throw something at you,
Yeah.
But seeing how he approached that and seeing how they approached that and having real experiences that were positive and not scary, quote unquote, and reactive and responsive. And it seemed like engaging just from coming in and saying, hey, like, we know we're in your space. We just want to be here. We want to talk to you and have a conversation with you. We don't come with any other intentions, instead to just interact with you. And seeing the interaction come back was amazing. And I think that's kind of goes into the storytelling aspect and what people get out of the stories that they put out. That energy is palpable, and energy can be created by us. So yeah, I feel like it can be imprinted and impressioned on things as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, even to get like, scientific about it, like I think recently, a few months ago, and this is kind of mainstream news, but a lot of people have thought this for a while, but it's now been proved that like, trauma is imprinted in our DNA. So if you kind of look at the world like, and look, I may sound kind of woo and new age here, but like that Earth is, kind of the Gaia idea of Earth is a living thing and animism and stuff like that. Well, trauma then could be, or fear or heightened emotions could be imprinted on a location. So, like, while this kind of sounds like, some paranormal speak, I think one day there's a potentiality for us actually putting fact behind this, because I too, like you kind of mentioned, I want to kind of circle back to something you mentioned earlier. You were talking about thought forms, kind of like the egregore idea, or, tulpas.
Tulpas, yeah.
Yeah, like, because there are examples, and I cannot think of one right now, where there was something that was a hoax, whether it was a Bigfoot sighting, but then like years later, people start actually seeing Bigfoot, like,
Yeah.
And obviously you have to take these stories with a grain of salt, but like, I think there's something to it. I really do. Like, so like, even like, I think, sometimes waves of UFO sightings can start with one person seeing UFO. And then the idea swirling around a community, and then people start wanting this UFO, to be seen in the skies. And maybe, there's a kind of a co-creation, like we're part of, whatever this phenomenon is.
Yeah, and on that same note, I've seen and just kind of heard since I just started creating content, but I've definitely been following along with a lot of the paranormal experts, I would say, and them going on cruise ships and boats, and them all getting together and doing stuff with their mind and intentions, and setting their intentions and creating events like clouds moving away from the moon, or UFOs coming from the water, or seeing strange lights and things like that. So I do agree with you on that forum too, that we're more powerful than we think,
Yeah.
to help co-create events that
Yeah.
we have just written off as paranormal.
Right. And like, even like what you said, you kind of you really inspired me with something you said just a couple minutes ago. And that was like, when you're going into an investigation, and I feel like I knew this and maybe do this anyway, because I've kind of recently, in the last 2 years, since I've been back in Nebraska, been trying to do more boots on the ground, talking to people, going to a lot of locations where these stories come from, just to kind of feel and sense the place. But I forgot what I was going to say. I was going somewhere with it. This happens to me. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
But yeah, like, it's all really just fun stuff to think about. But what I was going to say, is that this inspires me even more to just, when I go into these things, to like try to put myself in a good mood, be really light, be really heavy. And even if it was something scary that happened here, try to be, go in with a more whimsical attitude as opposed to like, oh boy, like
Yeah, and you saying that it actually reminded me of something. Even Aaron was like, when we were just chatting it up and we were laughing. He was like, "No, this is good because your laughter is pushing out that good energy. It's natural, it's genuine, and it's showing kind of the intentions that you have." And I'm relatively new to the investigation standpoint,
Mhm.
but owning a coffee shop, this makes sense though because when people walk through the door, sometimes they're in a horrible mood,
Yeah.
but if I set the tone and the atmosphere and the energy in the coffee shop when they walk in, it's an instant change. If I've created a space where there is laughter and love and light and good intentions, because they're going to feel that energy, is going to be palpable. And even if it doesn't change them right away, it's going to work on them for the rest of the day because they're going to go into the coffee shop. They're going to get that energy reset. They're going to feel it. They're going to say, okay, maybe the day that I'm going through today isn't as bad as I think it is. And this person was really nice to me. And this atmosphere is very warm. And now I'm kind of thinking on some good things now instead of the bad things. And I'm going to take this energy, which is contagious, with me. And now I'm going to have a smile on my face when I leave, as opposed to the frown on the face that I had when I came in. And so I definitely agree with that. And I think that's a great way. Like, I don't have the investigation experience, but if you think it like thinking about it from a human to human standpoint, I think that that makes sense because
Mhm.
some of these entities or things that we encounter, I believe now even more, are human in nature. And how would a human want to be interacted with from another human? And so I think that same rule might apply on the other side. Like if I'm still here as a human, I still have human emotions, human feelings. I still I'm still human. I still understand what this is. And if you come in and investigate and you want to talk to me, well, maybe if you come in a great way, like you won't scare me off for one by calling me a demon. And
Yeah.
number two, um, I feel better now, and maybe I interact a little bit more.
Yes. It makes you wonder if, like like the movie Exorcist or something like that, if the priest would have come in and said, like, "You're not a demon, you're an angel," and would have maybe that's a new tactic for, exorcists, out there, Maybe maybe
Kindness and
maybe
reverse psychology.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, they don't wanna be called demons, so that's why they're so angry. I love it, I love it. So, you mentioned that before you started creating content and stuff, you had been a fan, just kind of more like, watching from the sidelines. Is
Yeah.
there like I am fascinated, and I'd love to hear about like urban legends from where people grew up. Was there one that as a kid from kind of, your neck of the woods where that kind of like grabbed you and you couldn't stop thinking about?
Definitely the one that's closest to home, and that was Spring Villa. It's actually the one that I grew up with. It's also the one that started kind of well, actually, I take that back. Spring Villa was number 2. There's a place over here called Smedley Road that I cannot find any information on to save my life, but I
Whoa.
knew about it. And it was a road that I was told to never go on. And it's the whole 9 yards with any of those type of roads.
Right.
Devil worshippers. It's a traditional satanic road
Right.
essentially. And I still kind of don't remember the urban legend. That's why I've been fighting so hard to find it. It's impossible to find on the internet. But it was the one that kind of like I always thought about. I always wanted to go on. So I still might find my way on that road at some point in the near future when I have some time. And then the second one was Spring Villa, and this was a campground that was in Opelika, so it's not super far. The property is like the actual haunted house sits on campground property. It's public access. You can literally walk around the
Wow.
property. At one point, you could go inside, but now it's a little decrepit, and they have people who watch it and vandalism and all that kind of stuff. Um, but that was number 2, and that's the one that I remembered more as I got a little bit older.
Right.
Um, and that's the one that I always wanted to see if I could bring out a team of folks to really like prove it or debunk it, just so
Right.
that the truth can be out. Because we've had some like amateur investigators, but nobody that's really like nobody
Mhm.
that really. And this is no disrespect to anybody, but sometimes you need like some heavy hitters to come out and say, "Yeah, okay, this place has some stuff going on," or "Eh, this is just an urban legend, but there could be some truth to it.
Yeah, that's we need John Tenney to come swooping
Yeah.
through on his, Concorde jet, landing and taking
Yep.
care of business.
Yep.
What's the story behind that? What's the little tale?
And forgive me if this is kind of rough because it's been a while since I've revisited the story.
Right, right.
Long story short, it was a home that was owned by kind of a traveler who was a businessman. He allegedly owned slaves, but it doesn't fit the time period that he was in. And he was said to mistreat his slaves. And so one day, one of his slaves was waiting for him in the nook of his spiral staircase on the 13th step. And he walked around the 13th step, and the slave killed him with a knife. And so ever since then, it allegedly had a haunting of like just ghostly activity, but mostly on certain nights when the moon was full, you could see the blood stain on the 13th step, and it would show up. The problem with this story, and this is why I really started trying to get in the nitty gritty of it, is that, like I said, the time frame doesn't match for a slave to be there, even after the decade or two where Alabama didn't get the memo that slavery was over. It still didn't match. The guy who owned the house, William Young, died way later than a slave would be waiting on a step, and apparently, allegedly, natural causes. And so there's some holes with the story,
Right.
but I learned that, and this is what kind of started the whole these stories are told in sociocultural movements. The story was first told a couple decades after all of this. It was told to 4-H camp kids. It was one of those get the flashlight up under your face kind of stories.
Yes.
And from there, those kids went and essentially anybody who came to that campground took it from the 30s and 40s, and they just kept it with them. And so that urban legend was birthed from basically a camp story.
And that's probably not the only one.
No, but the interesting thing is that this place, and I hate to do this in particular, but I have done some research on this actual land. So there's a couple of different things that I find very interesting. I'll say that. This land goes along the line of the Uchi Creek. The Uchi Creek has some urban legends of its own, and this does come from the Native American people who were there. One of them is a tie snake. So in the Uchi Creek, there are some places where there's some underwater caves, but there's also a legend where there's a giant constrictor-like snake that will pull you underwater. So they would tell travelers or people, don't go in the water in these areas because the snake will come and get you. Number two, this land was considered sacred, but it was an actual meeting spot for the native tribes. So fast forward, people have seen and claim to see two different entities on this property. One is a Bigfoot-like creature in and around these woods, and a lot of these woods are very dense. They're not traveled. It's hunting land strictly, so little foot traffic, and kind of a dogman-esque entity there as well. And the second thing is that there's actually a natural lake nearby, or pond or lake. It's technically a lake, where a couple of girls did drown, and they had some paranormal activity surrounding that as well. And so it's like a place where a lot of urban legends are around, and it almost feels like they had to find an urban legend for this place too, because of all the other urban legends that were around.
Right.
So it's a fascinating property, but I would have never known this if I never took the time to look.
Right.
So it's cool to uncover other urban legends in the process of looking at an urban legend, and how it's intertwined. So that's kind of the short version of the story. There's obviously more, but,
Right.
And last but not least, I guess I'll say this while I'm here because I'm already long-winded enough.
No, I love it. I love it. It's great.
I discovered that there was a freedman who actually built this house, and maybe like 30 to 40 different bridges throughout the entire South. So in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Mississippi, he was everywhere. His name was Horace King, and he built. Um, he was one of the only freedmen to have some of the freedoms that he had. So for one, he was able to purchase his freedom, which was unheard of in the mid 1800s. Like nobody was doing that. Nobody was letting you do that unless you had something to offer, and he did. He was so good at building. He surpassed his former master, who taught him how to build at building. So he built places like the Albany Bridge House. He built Spring Villa. He built Opelika's courthouse and jail. He built the first bridge to cross the Chattahoochee from Phoenix City to Columbus. He built so many different things, and it helped me uncover somebody who I would have never really known about because they don't cover people like Horace King just through the urban legends.
That's amazing. That is amazing. And, and with a lot of this stuff, it seems like, like, and I found this myself by, researching Eastern Nebraska. Like, I will go in looking for one thing, and then I'll find like actually 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different things that are actually more interesting.
Yeah.
And and a lot of times, you can be frustrated because when you look into this stuff, I rarely find, answers per se, but I just have more and better questions.
Yeah. And
But that's a good thing too, right? It's like, I mean, like, to me, part of me is like, like, oh gosh, if, like, somehow we unlock all the answers to this stuff, like, I'm like, there goes the mystery of life, like, I feel like the mysteries are part of what, gets us up in the morning, like,
yeah.
obviously, like, you got to work, you got a family and all that stuff, and that's fine. But like, mystery is addictive, it's contagious, and it's communal. It brings people together. It's like,
Yeah.
I feel like, and that's one of the many reasons I love what you're doing is because I think they're, with kind of this convenient society of like, there's 1,000 different TV shows out there. So like, TV used to be a thing where the whole water cooler thing where people on Monday would come and talk about the episode they saw. We've kind of lost that, where it's kind of these consensus stories. But you putting them out there into the world, I think probably you are building a community that you don't even know about. Like,
yeah, I've seen that though. I have people that I wouldn't expect to be into it and actually kind of foster and in some way kind of lead a folk community. I mean, we don't have any groups or anything, but when I'm on live, I always see them in there, or when I'm post a video, I always see them around, and it's been cool to see that too.
Yeah,
because I'm hitting areas that they didn't think would ever be covered, let alone on TikTok or in a social space, or as boldly. Because I always said that if I ever got a platform, I'm gonna center Alabama as much as I possibly can, and that's not something anybody has done yet or has chosen to do. And
right.
It's not like we have tons of people from Alabama doing this. We have a few, but because I'm still here, because like I would not be doing this if I did not grow up in Alabama, if I wasn't born here, if I didn't have questions that I couldn't get answered, and if Alabama didn't have stories that pulled me in. So it's kind of cool to also build that community around a place that nobody ever talks about in a national scope for anything, except dumb stuff or bad stuff.
Right. And the thing is, like, I mean, kind of the states that have like, we've all heard about Skinwalker Ranch and a lot of stuff that's gone in Utah. California is full of weirdness, but it's kind of, I always felt when I lived in California for all those years, well, it's kind of well-worn territory. I'm not sure what to do with it. There's a lot of stories and a lot of fantastic folkloric history, but it has been written about, talked about, it's become films. So it's like, I felt like wasn't really contributing anything, but like, I feel like a lot of these, the thing is, I feel like every place is weird. Every place has stories.
Yeah.
And what I really hope happens with, what you're doing is that more people are inspired to start preserving the folklore of where they come from.
Yeah.
And then we can mix and match and we can compare notes. Like, sometime off air, I'd love to just like talk to you and like say, hey man, this is what I'm finding in Nebraska. Are you hearing anything like this? And we can kind of, learn from each other and start asking better questions, about this stuff.
I would love to do that too because I would love to bounce. So I've been finding a lot of the stories that go into the 1800s actually coincide with the Reconstruction era.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to see if that is the case for other places that aren't even necessarily in the South. Um, I've seen a lot of the underwater towns. A lot of those stories circulate somewhere around Reconstruction. So either at the beginning of Reconstruction or at the tail end. So what about that specific time? What about that specific era is why either the urban legend started or why these towns were drowned? And usually I can kind of read between the lines, especially in the South. But why would that be the case in a place that's like Nebraska or
Yeah.
Montana or the Dakotas?
Right.
I'd love to do stuff like that. And I agree. I hope it does like push people to dig a little deeper in their states because I've uncovered so much history that I would have personally never known because it was never taught. Even when you learn state history in schools, that I wish I would have known because it makes your states so much more interesting and gives
Yes.
it a levity that you don't find in uh, like formal education. And it's incredible to see how many historic figures pass through these haunted and spooky and creepy and don't tell me that kind of stories um, just haphazardly or on the regular and just casually just pop up. I'm actually doing a story now where uh, a hotel is super haunted and it just happened to be the place where uh, Lady Bird Johnson and Lyndon B. Johnson had their first date. Like it's just random stuff like this that you just find
Yeah.
out. So now, if I ever go on Jeopardy or something, and they ask, I'm like, well, that's Austin, Texas, at the Driscoll Hotel. Um, so it's cool to also come across stuff like that. And as a curious person by nature, that gives me nutrients.
Yeah, man, I could not agree more. Like because what has happened, like I've always had like a pretty mild interest in history. Like I didn't wasn't disliking it, but I wasn't actually seeking out history until I started looking at Nebraska. Now downstairs, I have two books I'm reading about the early history of when they were founding the states. Lewis and Clark's travels through here. I mean, like now I feel like I'm almost a Nebraska historian, amateur, obviously, but
Yeah.
because to understand this folklore and these mythologies and the phenomenon that surrounds it, you have got to look at the history, or you'll just
Yeah.
come across a history and be like, "Oh, that's interesting. That kind of connects to this." So you become a history buff because of your fascination with weird stuff.
By default, essentially.
Yep.
Another great example of this, like loosely associating with each other, is and becoming a historian by default. I would have never known any significance about Flagler, like ever, for anything. I wouldn't have cared less about Flagler if I heard him on like a normal day. I'd be like, oh, okay, cool. It has nothing to do with me. But because looking into the ghost stories and going on ghost tours and listening to the history, you realize how deep his imprint is throughout the South, like South Florida, like the eastern coast of Georgia. Flagler's influence in architecture goes in a place like where I like just across the area. I covered a story about in Americus about their haunted hotel, and one of my friends who is also in the paranormal, but also kind of like a default historian as well,
Mm-hmm.
was like, "Oh, I knew I recognized this building because the building had to be designed by Flagler because of this insignia or this like building structure." And I was covering a story in Savannah, and so it's like it's a cool triangle where you can start recognizing just buildings that people
Yeah.
have built that have never had any history about them. We can say, "Oh, that's a Henry Flagler building in a place that's not even where Henry Flagler is talked about." But now you can see it through because you're a default historian now.
Oh
You know what his
yeah.
buildings look like. So I had that happen a couple of months, maybe about 6 months ago, and it was the coolest thing because now I'm even more embedded in the history, and so
Yes.
I understand what you mean. How it that the history just kind of draws you in.
It forces you because I mean you can only go so far with the actual like case. Like if you're studying like a UFO encounter where someone has an experience with the UFO knots coming off a craft, whatever. Well, you can only glean so much about that actual event. But what now and for a while, for a long time, I would read about the event, maybe read about it again and go, huh, that's interesting. It sounds like this event. Now I'll read about the event once and I will read about the small village in western Nebraska where it happened.
Yeah.
And when I do that, oh my gosh, I have my questions become a lot better and a lot smarter, I think,
Yeah.
because I've researched the culture, the history, what is the predominant religion, what do people eat there, what do they grow around there, like it all plays a part into the richness of these stories.
It does, and it makes you look a little bit beyond. Not even a little bit. It makes you look a lot more beyond just the surface.
Yeah.
Especially UFO lore
Hmm.
is so intertwined with each other
Yeah.
that if you don't know the history, you just get sucked up into all the stories and be like, "Wow, I can't believe that exists."
Yeah.
But in some cases, like, and I'm not going to stay on the subject for a little while, because the UFO stuff kind of spooks me from a from a humanistic
Right.
standpoint,
I hear
not
you.
even from the alien standpoint. But then you look into like the CIA and like
Yeah.
how they've intertwined with
Oh
UFOs, and
yeah.
now when you hear a story, it makes you not look at it from the same surface level that you would, like, oh, Independence Day, like, yeah, the UFOs and aliens are coming to get us. Now you're like, I wonder who was part of the CIA during this time period, and
Well, yeah, I
yeah,
mean,
and
I've worked
the
in
rabbit hole.
entertainment. I mean, truly, I mean, this not to sound conspiratorial, but I mean, like, I think that, well, I won't even go there. But let's just say there's been a couple agency people walking around in the lots in the studio lots of Hollywood since the golden age.
I believe that.
Infecting propaganda. I mean, like wartime propaganda was the best way to get. I mean, like, look, Top Gun was the best recruiting tool in the
I believe it.
history of anything. The next week after the first Top Gun came out, they had the record breaking, like, like to the Air Force, everyone wanted to be a pilot. So
I believe
it
it.
is effective. And that's the story they're telling. So,
And seeing
um,
sweaty men fly planes and pretty much that's it. Like no training, like
yeah,
whatever. Like it's just training in the air all the time and sweaty
yeah,
men going to the bar afterwards.
yeah,
Yeah, I would sign up too. Like,
yeah.
well played.
I think the only requirement back then was like if your hair can look good while sweating in a small like space, you're in.
And if you like Danger Zone, this is the place for you.
If the danger zone is the location you appreciate, well, you got the job, kid. I don't want to forget this because what is I'm glad you mentioned it earlier about the disappearing or the underwater towns. This is about 5 minutes ago. I'm sorry, I'm circling back to this because I didn't want to forget it because
Yeah.
I watched a story you did about, and I'm going to probably butcher the name, the Cowliga,
Yeah. So
the Cowliga
I
Benson. Oh my God, can
I
you
ma- I
tell
made a
people about that?
I made a grave mistake in my very first video that I made about this. It was a two-parter, and I called it Cowaliga. It is not Cowaliga. Everybody in Alabama let me know it was not
Oh,
Cowaliga. And honestly, I should have known it wasn't. And so this was one of those learning lessons that I had really early on into this, making sure that I double check pronunciations as much as possible. It's actually Kalijah,
Kalijah.
and I you can't tell me how we got there, but
Right.
that's literally maybe 30 minutes down the road from me.
Ooh.
And Alabama has a lot of just weird. Like a quick aside, Alabama has a lot of weird names that we don't pronounce right, and then get mad when people pronounce them correctly. Like Lafayette is or Lafayette or whatever, however you want to say it, because now they've gotten me messed up.
Right.
Is Lafette. Like that's how we say it.
Lafette.
Lafette.
Interesting.
If you say Lafayette or Lafayette over here, people will literally have a full-on meltdown that you said that.
I'm glad you told me.
So don't ever come here and say, "Yeah, So I passed through Lafayette." I literally think they'll spontaneously combust because you said that, and it's like we're saying it wrong, but like we have so much. Anywho, yeah. So the Kalijah story is actually very fascinating. It's one of those that does coincide with the Reconstruction era, but long term, more than it started in the Reconstruction era. Well, it kind of did actually. I would say this is an era that I call um, the inspiration, the inspiration of the Black community, because Reconstruction uh, really does center around uh, Black people being inspired to create thriving communities of their own now that they had the opportunity to be free, and have free thought and be able to intertwine with the government system more and things like that. So this is one of those instances where this was happening in mass, and um, the powers that be kind of stuffed it. So there was a guy, and his name was John Benson. So the town had a couple of names. It was named Kalijah for um, the indigenous tribes that lived there. They named that Kalijah. That was their name. The American or United States or renamed version was Benson, and that was named after John Benson. He was a slave in that area, right along the river, and he worked there until he eventually got sold over across the way to, I believe, Talladega. Um, he would get sold back to the same area, and his sister would be sold to Florida. He'd work there. His master would die. Eventually, he gained his freedom. And when he gained his freedom, all he had was a mule. He literally went to Florida and searched every part of Florida until he found his sister.
Oh,
He did, and he brought her back
it's
to the area.
incredible. That's incredible.
Yep, he was, and I don't even. It still baffles me that he was
Like,
able
how
to
would you do? Florida's first off, like any
Gigantic.
state, even 100-yard, I mean, like
Yeah.
100-mile like radius seems impossible. But a whole state back
and
then with no technology, I mean, it seems impossible.
And at this time, it was even bigger than it is now. So like, and less defined too. So he came back to the land that he worked because it was familiar to him, and he would continue to work that land until he would get a job at the Shelby coal mining factory, essentially. So he was making a little bit of money there, and he bought himself a little parcel of the same land. So now he owned land on the same land that he worked as a slave. Over time, he continued to make money, and he continued to buy parts of that land because now that slavery was over with, white farmers couldn't keep up with the demands of the labor on the fields. So what he would do is he would then start hiring both black and white men to come and work on this property until he eventually bought his entire plantation, and then 3,000 acres total of land. And from here, he was still, so he not only, so he would buy other plantations that were adjacent until he bought 3,000 acres worth of basically like plantation land.
Right.
And he would, like I said, employ black and white workers. And they would start building a little community. And the community would continue to grow until it had like multiple different types of mills. It would have housing. It had over 100 families on this land. And it became a town. And he became pretty wealthy to the point where he became the town's bank.
Wow.
And so, yeah. So people would come and get their mortgages and be lent any money from him. Like he would lend them money for them to be able to go and get their houses and do other things. So it was a self-sustaining community that would eventually have a school. It would have a church. It would have everything that a self-sustaining community would need. It became so big that it was considered the largest black community in the entire country at the time.
Really?
Yeah, and just the small town of Alabama. And so it would eventually take on a faux name, Kalijah or Benson. And over time, he'd have kids. Those kids would go and get a great education. His son would come back and officially form a school for kids in the surrounding area. He would, touch hands with a lot of the well-known like black figures of the time. So the educators, and so they would come and they help and they train and all that kind of stuff. So this was legitimately a fully sustained community. And then on top of that, and this is also the short version. I'm
Right.
just keeping it quick. But then they would start a railroad line, and it'd be the first black-owned railroad line in the entire country. So this town was thriving. It had tons of people. It was adjacent to a water source. It had everything that they needed. They literally did not need to go anywhere to have everything that they needed. The kids were being taught STEM. They were also taught trades, so STEM and trades at the school. So they were getting applicable skills and also knowledge that, once again, they couldn't go to, like a old country school and get.
Right.
And so the Dixie Railroad Company um, would become one of the top suppliers of products from little small town Alabama, and to the point where they had international clients coming to Alabama for them to get their products specifically. But as you approach the 1910s, Alabama Power is starting to say, "Hey, like, I don't know how much we like that. That's not really cool." Like,
Oh,
so in true fashion, like every other place, Lake Lanier, you have multiple lakes in Alabama, like Logan Martin. You have um what is the other one up north? You have the one where Falls Creek, the town was. Um, said, hey, like we need to provide power to this community, but not this community because they're self-sustaining and black and they're thriving. We need to create power for this other community. So they essentially waited for John Benson to die and his son to die to tell the community, hey, get gone or get flooded, essentially. And so they built Lake Martin. And not only did they flood the town of Benson, but they also flooded a couple other cities like Susanna, which had a gold mine, like pharmacy. They were also another self-sustaining black community. And any of the indigenous villages that were still there along the water. They flooded those too, and so they completely washed those. Towns away, and you could still go into Lake Martin to scuba dive and come across a post office. It's still intact under the water.
really?
So, long story short, that was like kind of it's a lesser known story. A lot of people don't know this story.
Yeah.
And so when I found it, I was like, I have to tell this story. Because people frequent Lake Martin. Lake Martin's probably the most popular lake in the entire state of Alabama.
Wow.
And most people never even knew that there were buildings and old towns up under the water. And they were flooded for the sake of having power for communities, and also because they were black self-sustaining towns. And you'll find stories like these in this time period throughout the country. So it's more than just Tulsa, but you have self-sustaining communities in Virginia, in Florida, you have them in Georgia, you have them just throughout the South in places where there were heavy concentrations of black people who were also skilled, free thinkers, and intellectual beyond how the society thought they should be. And so I've, like I said, I've always been curious, kind of going back to another point on how I can connect those dots to other places that aren't necessarily in the South and see if that same cultural movement was happening in large proportions in other places where we don't really talk about it.
This, I mean, see, okay, this is a great example of what I'm talking about, listeners, because I had no idea when I watched that video. I was just like floored. I mean, that is such an important story. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
like it's so wild I mean, that should be common knowledge. That should be taught in schools. It's disgraceful, really. That's not a story that's out there. So, I mean, like, people, I'm telling you that's the thing about Joshua's videos he makes. It's like you do cover urban legends and paranormal stuff, but like this story truly like blew me away, like in such a emotional way. Like it's really wild stuff, and I just it's what a tragedy.
Well, I'm thankful that you took the time to listen and found that one, because I do have stories like that I kind of sprinkle in that I think are important for history.
Mm-hmm.
So I have one about an election massacre that nobody talks about in Alabama. I'm going to be covering the lawn jockey and its true origins, or fake origins, pretty soon. So most people don't realize that they've seen this figure before and where it comes from. But it's an urban legend in itself, and it's not a paranormal urban legend; it's a history urban legend. And if you've ever seen like a little short miniature statue of like a black child with like over exaggerated features, that actually has a place in history, and it's maybe one of the longest running urban legends in the United States, um, because it goes all the way back to George Washington.
Wow.
So it's one of, I guess, I hate to use this term, but it's the only one I can think of. I guess like I'm not going to actually say this word. I'm going to say conquered United States. I
Right.
should say that. And I've done a story about Marie Bankhead Owen and how she essentially sabotaged Alabama history in the mid 1900s and late 1900s, and how she helped um, infiltrate Southern schools, not just Alabama schools, but Southern schools with apologists, um, Southern sympathetic history. So that's influenced the way that we've talked about the Confederacy um, up until like the 80s, and still even to now, because some of those schools don't have the resources to get better books. So it's a whole, like, it's a conspiracy, but it's true because there's a paper trail, and how she ran the archives, and how she um, created these different texts, um, being a Confederate sympathizer that taught a lot of the generations in the 60s and 70s and 80s in these history books in Alabama and the South. So I have stories like those too, where it's just straight up history, but
Yeah.
things that we need to know because
Yep.
we wouldn't otherwise. So I like to toss in stories like those.
And that's the thing. I think a lot of people, Joshua, like don't realize they like history until they
Yeah.
hear these stories. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I feel like, when you're a kid, history can become a drag, and it's not, and like, and largely that's the fault of the education system, because I
Yeah.
think a lot of, like, I remember when we were learning, like Nebraska state history, and I remember, like, as a kid looking in the back, and it was written, Nebraska history was written by people in Dallas, Texas. I'm like, they're not even from here.
Yeah.
So it's like you're getting such a baseline kind of, in history is often told through the victors and the elite
Yeah.
class. And it's a version of history, but it's not the full story. And I feel like, by, the stories you're doing, I think you are really rounding out the history of Alabama and the South. And it's really important that you're doing this, man. Like, I know, like, I really hope you continue on with these historical stories too, because I think, like, man, like, we were just saying at the beginning of this podcast that if somebody is not telling these stories, they will go away.
Yeah.
Like, we could come a time where half the internet's lost for some reason. And, and even on the internet, you can get far, but you can't, it doesn't have everything.
Yeah.
And so these lesser known stories find a way to disappear. So it's so important that you're doing this. So thank you, man. Like,
I
truly.
appreciate that. I appreciate that. And hopefully somebody will take the mantle, or I can find a way to platform these stories even better. More than anything, this is like, and I'm always saying this for manifestation purposes, but I'm really trying to create like a legitimate TV show with like legitimate producers and like a legitimate network that can center some of these stories, because they truly need to be told.
Yep.
And they need to be told with more than just the research that I do. They need to be told through libraries. They need to be told through archives. They need to be told with major productions, because there's a lot of important history that needs that has not been even shared yet, that some TikToker shouldn't just be uncovering. Like, this should be common knowledge. And I think that when it comes to our history and like what we're taught, a lot of times too, you make a good point about how Nebraska history told through the lens of Dallas, and probably the Dallas elite or the publishers.
Yeah, exactly.
And instead of it being expansive and like actually delving into, okay, black people were more than just slaves, like the indigenous people were more than just savages, and there's some people who immigrated, but that's cool. Presidents, all the cool things the presidents did. You could be a president too, kind of narrative. Like, it needs to be more than just like rudimentary. And I think it does everybody a disservice, because if you can't see yourself in history, you're not really going to care about history. And I think these stories have an important place in saying, like, hey, like, no, Horace King was a free man who bought his own freedom and was able to marry a freed woman as a slave at the time, and go on and do great things without like. And now you see his influence throughout the place that you walk through every day.
Yeah.
And now you see that his family could benefit from something cool. And I think that history could care to be shown through that lens
I
more
agree.
often.
And it seems like, with the oh my gosh, Kalija,
Kalijah.
Kalija. My gosh, Kalija, Kalija. With the Kalija story, it's like essentially they tried to erase history of a place
Yeah,
by flooding it.
by flooding
So
it.
I mean,
And
you know,
they were almost successful. The problem is that his family line, his direct descendants are still very much alive, and they
Mhm.
live in the same area. And so it's hard to do away with the history when the history is living, literally.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man. Well, I love that story. That really resonated with me. It was very powerful, and you did such an amazing job of telling it on the thing. So I highly recommend
Thank you.
checking out that one, people. I do before we wrap up. I know the UFO topic kind of scares you, but I'm a kind of a UFO nut. Not a UFO nut, but I love UFO stories. I have my whole life. But I love the Falkville, Alabama case.
Yeah, that's
It's especially since it kind of it reminds me of my favorite UFO case from eastern Nebraska, Herbert Shermer, who in 1967 had a close encounter experience, was taken up aboard the craft, but when he told his story, it ruined his life, and he was a police officer. And they blew up his car with dynamite. They were hanging effigies. The church called him a demon from hell. So much so, this guy was like a war hero. He was like 22 years old. He had to change his name and leave the state and just move. And it ruined his
wow.
life. But it kind of seems like this is almost the same thing with the officer in the Falkville case.
Yeah, it is. Even now, like I reposted that a while ago just to see like how people would respond to it now. Um, and it's very similar. So sometimes you'll see a repost or two. It's generally because I'm trying to gauge where the audience is and like how they
Right.
feel about these same stories because it changes over time based on like where they're at. But it was very similar, and he did get pretty much ruined his reputation because he had an experience that he couldn't explain, and people were like, "Wow, that's like so fantastical! Like, what are you talking about? You're no longer credible, and I don't know if I want you serving
Yeah.
as our lead for this agency." And so it is similar, and honestly, his story is a little fantastical, but I
Yeah.
think because it's so stories like these, it's the reaction from the public that makes me kind of scratch my head a little bit as to whether or not it's actually real or not.
Mhm.
Because the ones that are so highly accepted, I tend to believe those a lot less.
Me too.
And I don't really have a reason why. It's more
Right.
of an intuition gut feeling because I can't prove it myself. But because he was so adamant and stuck to the story for that long, it makes me wonder what he saw legitimately and what he had an encounter with. Because
Right.
he quite frankly could have had an encounter with some like secret like military organization. They weren't expecting
Mm-hmm.
anybody to be out there at that time. They're
Sure.
testing out some new technology. They're wearing some goofy looking suit because that's all they know to wear and they haven't refined it, and so they want to protect the person in there. Or it could have been something else. I tend to go along the lines when it comes to UFO stuff that um it's more so like military related. Like
Yeah.
that's just how I feel about it.
Well, there's proof of that. Like
Yeah.
and they've been obfuscating the whole UFO thing, whether it's a real phenomenon or not. The military and the CIA and all those people have used it to protect their own interests
Yeah.
for many years. So
And I will say, just in case, because they're gonna listen, probably.
yeah, I hope
Um,
so.
Good for them.
I need all
Because
the Thank you, CIA.
yeah, because personally, I'd rather them test this out, like not where the public can see often,
Yeah.
because God only knows what they're trying out, and God only knows how many times they fail,
Yeah.
more than they succeed. And like, I don't think we really need to see them fail a lot. That
No.
does not instill a lot of confidence. So,
No, it doesn't.
in anything, but I tend to fall towards it being like just military related stuff, but
Right.
with the disinformation campaigns and stuff like that, it's really hard to tell like what is
Yeah.
true and what's not. So I don't
It
even
is.
really think about it. And honestly, because it's so like intertwined with the military, I tend to just I don't know if I like talking about it yet or not.
Yeah, no, I
So
hear you. Well, like that's why. I mean, I kind of like I say this on my show all the time, but like I'm not really interested in the disclosure government
Yeah.
relationship.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the high strangeness aspect, and kind of something you said earlier about his story was so fantastical and super weird
Yeah.
that it makes me think, because I feel like a lot of times when a UFO story or a paranormal story is too organized and follows like a very common narrative, I am immediately kind of disinterested.
Yep.
But when it's
I'm out.
yeah, but when it's super weird, I'm like, well, if you want it to be believed, if you're making up a story and you want to be believed, I feel like you would try to follow the most believable story. But
Yeah.
the Falkville case, I mean, this guy sees entity in like a metal
A
suit.
metal suit. And it was like
Yeah,
kind of not even attached to itself in a
yeah,
weird way. And it
yeah,
ran with strides longer than what a normal human could have,
right. Faster
and
than his car.
faster than his car. In a like in a place where he could easily catch this in his car
Yeah.
if it was a normal human.
Yes.
And so and he stayed he had everything to lose in telling the story, and yet he still told it, which
Yep.
makes me tend to believe that he really saw something.
Yes.
What that is, I can't say. But
Right.
it was something enough for him to say, I know that people trust me and my credibility, but I got to tell this story like right now.
Yeah.
And you know, I I also find it interesting that UFO activity tends to happen around paranormal
Uh-huh.
things too.
Yep. And
There's
sacred sites. I mean, like there is definitely, I mean, I'm not even sure if I see the UFO phenomenon as any different than all the rest of the paranormal stuff. To me, it's just
yeah,
maybe a different kind of manifestation. It appears in a different way, but it might all be the same darn thing. Who knows?
yeah,
But like, with the Falkville thing, it's like when you read the story, I'm like, I kind of believe that the officer believes what he saw. I don't, like, and that's all we can really, at the end of the day, get with
yeah,
a witness is like, well, if sometimes you can really tell that they're making something up, but there's a lot of times where I'm like, and I've talked to witnesses myself here in Nebraska. Like I'm working with a guy who's a bow hunter who's had some pretty dramatic Bigfoot sightings, and like you don't think of a Bigfoot in Nebraska, and I don't know if he saw a Bigfoot, but I believe after spending time with this guy, I believe that he believes because he has nothing to gain from this. I had to beg him to talk to me, and he's not trying to become
yeah.
famous. He doesn't want his name out there, so I'm like, it just feels like if you're gonna make something up, like I don't know, it's interesting. I wish we had more time,
Yeah.
Joshua, dude. I hope. I mean, I got through like not even a third of the questions I have for you, so I would beg you to come back on because you were so damn interesting, and I would. I have so many questions I would love to get to, but unfortunately, we don't have enough time right now. But please, you are invited anytime you want to talk about any of your work or just shoot the breeze. You are welcome on this podcast. I would love to have you on again, my friend.
Yeah, thank you. Just message me and I'll be here as quick as I can. So
I will.
anytime, and
I
I love
will.
talking to you. So this was a great time, and honestly, I could probably keep going for another 2, 3, 4,
Yep.
5, 6,
Me
7,
too,
8,
man.
9, 10 hours or so.
Me too. Me too. I
Um,
mean, like, this is the stuff I live to talk about. I mean,
I
I love
love
it.
talking about this stuff.
I mean, the whole reason I'm doing this show is so I can talk to people like you. So, is there anything you want to plug? Do you want to give out your, please give out your TikTok and where they can find you on Instagram so people, can immediately go run to their phones or computers and watch your videos.
Yeah. You could find me everywhere at Joshua Dairen. You don't even have to put the spaces or the ats in there. Just put Joshua Dairen. I'll pop up. It's Dairen. Um, please go watch the documentary that I'm a part of, World's Scariest Places, on Tubi. I spent 5 hours talking in a studio at a person with like a piece of paper in their hand in a room that I was looking at outside of the window while I was talking. So I put a lot of effort into that. So y'all, please go watch that. It's not as magical as it appears on the screen. It took a long time. I was
Yeah.
very sweaty
Yeah.
boy. So please go watch that on Tubi. Oh no, it's not World's Scariest Places. I'm even telling you wrong. Scariest Places in the World.
Scariest places in the world on
It'll
Tubi.
it'll on Tubi. It'll pop up, and there's also some really cool friends of mine on there. You have Alex. I'm gonna forget her name, last name, but you'll know it. Know it when you see it.
Shout out to Alex.
Becky Ann Galentine. She makes an appearance at the end. Intuitive Tani. So Tani's on there. My friend Corey, haunted historian. there's a couple of people who are some good people on there that I know, uh, who also make an appearance. So if you don't support me, at least support them at the very least, because they also put in the work for it too. Other than that, yeah, just keep an eye out. I have some cool projects coming out pretty soon, and yeah, I think that's it. Follow me, message me. I like to talk. I might do another Strange Escapes event later this year. We'll see.
Cool.
Fingers crossed that Amy liked me enough to invite me back. So
How could she not? You are such a, I mean, dude, you bring the goods and you're such a highly likable, humble person. I mean, you know, you're the whole package, baby.
Well, thank you. You're really buttering my biscuits.
Well, I'll tell you what, folks, I am going to be eating the rest of my leftover Thai green curry and watching Josh Spookiest Places on Earth.
Scariest places in the world.
Scariest Places in the World on Tubi. I'm going to be finishing my curry. Probably have to make a little extra steamed rice to go with it because I ate too much of it last night. And watching that this evening sounds like some great summer evening watching stuff. Watching stuff? Watchables. Watchables? It's a great watchable.
Yeah.
It's a great watchable. I can't talk. English is hard. My friend, thank you so much for coming on. We will do this again soon. You have an incredible week. Thank you so much for your time, bud. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
All right, Joshua. Take care, brother.
You too.